Hello, welcome to English Day with Miri. Today we are going to talk about modal verbs. Modal verbs express possibility, ability, obligation, permission, and advice. Let's start with ability. The modals we use when we talk about abilities are can, could, and be able to. Can is used to talk about general ability, while could, as a past tense form of can, is used to express general ability in past tense. For be able to, it has the same meaning with can, only it can be used to talk about temporary or precise abilities. Let's have some examples. Lisa can speak 3 languages. In our first example, we use the modal verb can, and in here, we are referring to the ability of the subject that she can speak not just 1 or 2 languages, but 3. Let's move on to our second example. She could speak Korean fluently. In here, we use the modal verb could. We are referring to the past ability of our subject. But even though we are using could, it does not mean that she cannot speak the language anymore. It means that she is not as fluent as she used to be in speaking Korean. And now let's have our last example. She is able to communicate from one language to another easily. For our last example, we used to be able to. Like how we explained it earlier, we talk about precise abilities when we use this modal verb. And in our example, we are referring to her ability to speak different languages simultaneously without difficulty. Now let's move on to the next one, which is permission. We use may, can, and could when we ask for permission. May and could are used to ask for permission politely. Moreover, may can also be used in formal settings or situations. For can in the English language is referred to as an informal way of asking for permission. Now let's have some examples. May I go out? This is a commonly asked question in school, especially if we need to go somewhere, like if we need to relieve ourselves and we need to go to the restroom. We commonly ask permission from our teachers and we say, "May I go out?" Now let's move on to the next one. Can I sit here? In here, it shows that the subject is just casually asking if he or she can sit in that vacant area. And for the last one, could I open the door? In here, the subject is politely asking if it is okay to open the door. Next, let's move on to advice. We use should and would when we give advice. Should is commonly used to give strong recommendation. On the other hand, would is used when we are trying to put ourselves in other people's shoes. That is why we commonly use if I were you with would. Now let's have some examples. You should visit your parents every holiday. In our first example, the person the subject is talking to is strongly recommending for him or her to go visit his or her parents every holiday. Most of the time, we get too busy with work that sometimes when we get a holiday or vacation, we choose to spend it alone or with friends. We do not notice that we do not spend a lot of time with our parents. That is why in this sentence, the person the subject is talking to is strongly suggesting that to our subject. Now let's move on to our second example. You should regularly consult your doctor. It is the same with the previous one. We can sense a strong recommendation coming from another person because it is important to keep ourselves fit and healthy all the time. Now let's have another example. I would go home early to study if I were you. If I were you, I would ask my parents first. For our third and fourth example, as you can see, we can use if I were you either at the beginning or end of the sentence. If you choose to use it at the beginning, please make sure to use comma. And for our meaning, since we are using if I were you in these sentences, we are telling the people listening to this sentence that if it were you or if you were involved in the situation, that is what you're going to do. Now let's move on to our next one, which is obligation. We use must and have to. We use must when we want to talk about specific obligations, and we use have to talk about obligation that is decided or that has been decided by somebody else. Let's have some examples. I must memorize all of these math equations for the exam. In here, we can sense that there is an obligation that the subject must do, and that is to memorize all of the math equations. There could be consequences if the subject won't be able to memorize all of the math equations, and that is to fail the exam. And for our next example, you have to take off your hat when attending your classes. In here, it shows that the decision to take his hat off was made by somebody else and not the person himself who was wearing it. And now, let's move on to our last one, which is possibility. We use might, may, could, and can to talk about possibility. All of them are the same. They all talk about something that can possibly or not possibly happen. They all talk about something that may or may not happen. Now let's have some examples. I quite like this phone model, but it might be very expensive. Lay may drop by later after class. I could help you study for the finals. So all of them showed possibilities in the future. Like for the first example, the subject took a liking to the phone model. However, he or she isn't quite sure whether she would buy it or not. There's a possibility, but there's a but there because we used might. Because if the phone model is too expensive or it will cost him or her a lot of money, then there's a possibility that he or she might not buy the phone model. Now for the second one, we have Lay may drop by later after class. Now in here, we use the modal verb may. And we mean there is a possibility that she drops by later after class or maybe not. Lay could change her mind later on or maybe not. Now for our last example, I could help you study for the finals. In here, there is also a possibility here saying that if you want to make things easier for you, then I could help you study. Now let's move on to the last part of our lesson, which is the test yourself part. All we have to do is to complete the sentences by choosing the correct modal. Let's begin with number 1. Blank, you play the guitar. If you answered can, then you are correct. In here, we are talking about the ability of the person to play the guitar. Let's move on to number 2. You blank get a job quickly if you speak their language fluently. If you answered might, then you are correct. There is a higher chance or possibility for a person to get hired or get a job quickly if he or she knows how to speak their language properly, correctly, fluently. And now let's move on to number 3. Blank, you like a cup of tea. If you answered would, then you are correct. In here, we are asking someone politely if he or she would like to be offered a cup of tea. In here, this is still considered a polite way of asking someone because the person might like a cup of coffee instead of a cup of tea, or maybe a glass of juice. That's why this is the correct modal to use. And let's move on to the next one. Blank, I close the window. If you answered may, then you are correct. You are politely asking someone if it's okay to close the window. And lastly, let's move on to the next one. I blank ruin the dress if I wash it. If you answered may, then once again you are correct. Just like what we explained earlier, may can also be used to talk about something that may or may not happen. And in this situation, since we do not know what the dress is made of, the material that was used to make the dress, then there's a possibility that it gets ruined. That's why we can use may for this sentence. Thank you for watching this video. Please make sure to hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe.